The rain had just begun to fall when Eleanor stepped off the bus, her heels sinking slightly into the damp earth of the quiet little town. She wore a deep emerald dress, the color of old secrets, and her dark hair clung to her pale skin like whispers of forgotten sorrow. The street was nearly empty, just an old man sweeping his porch and a stray dog watching from the shadows. Eleanor did not belong here, and yet she carried herself as if she had known this place in another lifetime. She had been to many towns like this before, leaving just as quickly as she arrived, each time hoping the curse wouldn't follow. But it always did. The moment she settled, men would be drawn to her, curious, fascinated, ensnared by something they did not understand. She had seen it too many times, a pattern carved into the very marrow of her existence. They would not simply admire her. They would need her. They would crave her in ways that frightened her. And then, as sure as the moon follows the sun, tragedy would strike. She had lost count of how many times it had happened. Their eyes would dim. Their bodies would weaken. Their souls seemingly claimed by a force she could neither see nor control. And so, she had learned to keep moving, to never let herself be known. But this time, as she stood beneath the old street lamp, her hands trembling at her sides, she felt something different in the air. A shift, a warning. Something about this town told her that this would be the last time she ran. It had started centuries ago, buried in the past like an unmarked grave. A woman of Eleanor's bloodline had wronged the wrong man. At least, that was what the old story said. The truth, however, was far darker. It was not a man she had wronged, but a force beyond mortal comprehension, a force that had loved her too much to let her go. That ancestor, a woman named Lilith, had been a healer, a giver of life, and a destroyer of hearts. She was beautiful, not in the way of queens or noble women, but in the way of something untouchable, something men longed to possess yet knew they never could. And when she refused to give her love to the one who demanded it most, a man with a soul blacker than the night itself, she was cursed. If I cannot have your heart, neither will any man who comes after me. The words had been spoken in a whisper, yet they had echoed for generations, passing from mother to daughter like an heirloom of sorrow. Every woman born from Lilith's bloodline carried the same affliction. Any man who fell in love with them would be doomed. Some suffered slow deaths, wilting away like flowers robbed of sunlight. Others faced crueler fates, losing their minds, their fortunes, their very will to live. It was a love that devoured, a love that destroyed. Eleanor had tried to resist it, tried to live a life untouched by affection, but love had a way of creeping in, uninvited, unwelcome, unstoppable. The moment Eleanor met Daniel, she knew. She had seen it before. The way his gaze lingered just a moment too long. The way his lips curled into a half-smile even before she had spoken a word. He was the kind of man women wrote poetry about, not because he was handsome, but because he was good. There was a warmth in him, a quiet gentleness that made people feel safe, and Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, found herself longing for that safety. He owned a bookstore on the corner of Main Street, the kind of place where time stood still, where dust and stories wove together like old friends. The first time she stepped inside, the scent of aged paper wrapped around her like an embrace. She should have turned around then. She should have left before he even noticed her. But she didn't. And so, when he greeted her with that soft-spoken kindness, she did what she had always done. She built walls. She distanced herself. She made herself cold. "New in town?" he asked, tilting his head slightly as if trying to read between the lines of her silence. She nodded but said nothing. He did not push. That was the problem with men like him. They never pushed. They simply waited, believing that patience could unravel even the most tangled of hearts. And so, against her better judgment, she returned the next day, and the next, and the next. She told herself it was harmless, that a few conversations meant nothing. But deep down, she knew better. She knew because she had seen it before. The hunger in his eyes, the way he would reach for books she had touched, as if wanting to hold something of hers. And she knew, just as surely as she knew her own name, that he was already lost. The first time she saw Daniel wince in pain, she felt the ice-cold grip of fate wrap around her throat. He had reached for a book on the highest shelf, and for a fleeting moment his expression had twisted, just a flicker of discomfort, a shadow passing over his usually steady hands. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Eleanor did. She had seen it before. The signs were always subtle at first. A sudden exhaustion, a fleeting headache, an ache in the bones that had no reason to be there. She told herself to walk away, to leave him before it was too late. But love, real undeniable love, does not allow itself to be ignored. And perhaps that was the cruelest trick of all. She did love him. She had tried not to, but what choice did she have? He was kind, and kindness was a language she had forgotten how to speak until him. And so she did what she had always done. She ran. She avoided the bookstore. She ignored his calls. She became a ghost in a town too small for ghosts. But love, once given, does not vanish so easily. It lingers. It waits. And when she finally saw Daniel again, standing outside her rented home, rain dripping from his hair, confusion and longing in his eyes, she knew she had failed. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. She wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to say, "Yes, you did something terribly wrong. You love me." But instead, she swallowed her pain and whispered, "You should stay away from me." He did not listen. They never listened. Small towns are like living, breathing things. They see, they hear, they judge. And in this town, Eleanor had become a ghost story before she had even lived long enough to be one. The women whispered about her in hushed tones over coffee, their voices laced with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "She's cursed," they said. "Every man who gets too close to her falls apart." They did not know the truth, not really, but they knew enough. The men, however, were different. Some stayed away, afraid of what she might bring. Others were drawn to her like moths to a flame, daring to believe they could be the ones to break the pattern, to claim her without consequence. But they were wrong. The pattern did not break. It only repeated. And so, as Daniel grew weaker, as his hands trembled when he turned the pages of his books, the town watched. They watched as Eleanor pulled further away, as guilt and grief carved themselves into spaces where love had once lived. And they whispered. Oh, how they whispered. Dr. Henry Whitmore had seen enough sickness in his life to know when something was real and when it was nothing more than fear wrapped in superstition. He had spent years treating men who believed in bad omens, women who whispered spirits, and families who clung to legends rather than logic. He did not believe in curses. He believed in science, in cause and effect, in truths that could be measured. And so, when he first heard the murmurs about Eleanor, the woman whose presence drained the life from any man who dared love her, he dismissed them as nothing more than small-town hysteria. But then he met Daniel, and Daniel was dying, not in the way that men who smoke too much or drink too often do, but in the way that defied medical reasoning. His blood work was fine. His heart was strong. Yet his body was failing. He was becoming a ghost of himself, slipping away from the world with each passing day. And Henry couldn't explain why. So he did what he always did. He searched for answers, and his search led him straight to Eleanor. He found her where he had expected, a woman who did not wish to be found. She was a contradiction of warmth and ice, of longing and restraint, a woman who seemed as if she wanted to love but had been taught never to. "You don't believe in curses," she said flatly when he asked her about Daniel. "No," he admitted, folding his arms. "But I do believe in patterns. And you, whether you mean to or not, you're part of one." She smiled then, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of sadness, of resignation. "Then I suggest you stop looking for answers, Doctor," she murmured. "Because if you keep searching, you might not like what you find." Henry had never been the kind of man to heed warnings. If anything, warnings only push him deeper into the unknown, like a sailor drawn to the edge of the world just to see if he would fall. And so, he ignored Eleanor's plea and searched anyway. He combed through old town records, asked questions that made the locals uneasy, and followed the whispers until they led him to a forgotten corner of the town library. There, buried beneath dust and time, he found it, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The name on the cover made his pulse quicken. Lilith Everhart, Eleanor's ancestor, the woman whose love had been stolen, the woman whose curse had begun it all. He opened it carefully, feeling the weight of history in his hands, and began to read. What he found inside chilled him to his core. It wasn't just a story of heartbreak. It was a story of betrayal. Lilith had not been cursed for loving too little. She had been cursed for loving too much. She had given her heart freely, blindly, and the man she had given it to had used it against her. He had owned her, controlled her, until she tried to escape. And when she finally did, he had damned her bloodline in revenge. "If I cannot have you," he had written in his final, rage-filled letter to her, "then no man ever will." Henry closed the book slowly, his heart pounding. This wasn't a curse born of magic. It was a curse born of cruelty, a man's cruelty, a man's vengeance, and it had haunted the Everhart women ever since. Eleanor had spent her life believing she was poisoned, that her love was a death sentence, that she was fated to be alone. But Henry had read the truth, and the truth was far worse than she had ever imagined. When he found her again, sitting alone by the river with a fog curled like ghostly fingers, he didn't ask for permission to speak. "It's not you," he said, his voice firm, steady. "It never was." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Hope, faint, flickering, but there. "What do you mean?" she whispered, and so he told her. He told her of Lilith's story, of the man who had marked her bloodline not with magic, but with something worse, with the power of belief. "Your family has been carrying a curse that was never real," he said, kneeling beside her. "Not in the way you think. It wasn't a punishment from the heavens. It was a punishment from a man who wanted to own a woman and couldn't stand that she refused him." He exhaled sharply, his breath misting in the cold air. And the worst part, he met her gaze. "It worked. Your family believed it. The men who loved them believed it. They all died because they believed they would." Eleanor's breath hitched. "But Daniel, he's dying because he thinks he's supposed to," Henry said fiercely. "This curse, it's not supernatural. It's psychological. It's in the mind, Eleanor. And the mind is the most powerful thing of all. If what Henry said was true, then love was not Eleanor's enemy. Fear was, and fear, once rooted, is harder to kill than any spell. That night, she sat by Daniel's bedside, watching the man she had tried not to love slip further into the darkness. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale, his body barely clinging to the weight of his own existence. And she knew, if she did nothing, he would die, not because of magic, not because of fate, but because he had accepted the lie. So she did the only thing she could. She leaned close, her hands trembling, and whispered, "You are not dying." His eyelids fluttered weakly. "Eleanor, listen to me," she said fiercely, gripping his hands, pressing them against her chest so he could feel the heartbeat that still lived there. "You are not dying. The curse isn't real. It never was." His lips parted slightly, as if struggling to comprehend, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. "You're sick because you believe you should be," she said, her voice breaking. "But it's a lie that's been told for centuries, a lie that we don't have to believe anymore." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Please, Daniel, don't let a dead man's words take you from me." He stared at her then, eyes unfocused, searching. And then something changed. It was barely noticeable at first, a shift in his breathing, a steadiness returning to his gaze. But it was there, the first crack in the curse, the first crack in the fear, and she held on to it with everything she had. Breaking a belief is harder than breaking a bone. It takes time. It takes effort. But most of all, it takes faith. Eleanor did not leave Daniel's side, not even when exhaustion clung to her bones like chains. She whispered to him through every fevered night, reminded him of the truth when doubt tried to creep in. And slowly, so slowly, he began to heal. His strength returned, his color deepened, his hands steadied. It wasn't magic. It wasn't medicine. It was something deeper. It was a decision to live. But there was one last test, one final choice. Because Eleanor had spent her life fearing love, and now she had to prove she didn't anymore. "Marry me," Daniel said one evening, his voice still weak but certain. Eleanor froze. "Daniel, if you believe the curse is broken," he said softly, "then love me without fear." The words struck her deeper than any wound. Love me without fear. She had spent years running. But now she had a choice, to run again or to stay, to let love in, to trust that the past did not have to dictate the future. And so, for the first time in her life, Eleanor did not run. She took his hand, and she said yes. The night was heavy with silence when Eleanor awoke, a strange chill wrapping around her skin like invisible fingers. It was not the cold that woke her. It was something else, something unseen but undeniably present. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against her chest as though she was being watched, judged, measured by something far beyond human. And then she heard it, a whisper, not from Daniel, who slept soundly beside her, but from the shadows that stretched long and dark across the walls. It was a voice that did not belong to this world, a voice that had waited centuries to be heard again. "You think you have broken me," it murmured, soft as a wind yet sharp as a knife. Eleanor's breath hitched. The spirit, the one who had cursed her bloodline, was here. It had been watching, waiting, feeding off her fear, and now that fear was beginning to slip through her grasp, it had come to remind her that she was never free. "You cannot change what is written," the voice continued, its presence swirling around her like smoke. "You are bound to me. You always will be." But Eleanor, for the first time in her life, did not cower. She did not shrink beneath the weight of those words. Instead, she sat up, her heartbeat steady, her jaw clenched. "You are nothing but a memory," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "A shadow of a man who never truly had power to begin with." The air crackled, as if the spirit itself had recoiled. "You were never a god," she continued, "just a man too weak to bear rejection. And your weakness will not define me anymore." And with those words, something inside the darkness shifted. The whisper turned into a growl, a final attempt to hold on, to keep its grip over her fate. But Eleanor did not look away. She did not surrender. And as the first light of dawn crept through the window, the spirit, his voice, his power, his presence, began to fade. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, like the first breath of spring after a brutal winter. Daniel's health improved, his once failing body gaining strength with each passing day. The color returned to his face, the light to his eyes. His hands, once weak and trembling, were now steady when they reached for hers. But it was not just Daniel who changed. It was Eleanor, too. She no longer walked with the weight of an unseen force pressing against her shoulders. She no longer feared her own existence. She had spent her life believing she was doomed to hurt those who loved her. But now, for the first time, she could see the truth. It was never her love that had destroyed men. It was the fear of a lie they had been told. And now, with that lie unraveling, she felt something foreign, something almost impossible settle inside her. Peace. But fear is a difficult thing to kill, and old habits do not die easily. Though Daniel's health improved, though Eleanor felt lighter than she ever had before, there was still doubt, lingering, waiting, whispering that this happiness was temporary, that the curse, even if it had been nothing more than belief, would find a way back to them. But days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, and still nothing came. No sudden sickness, no looming disaster. Only life, beautiful, fragile, but undeniably real. And as Eleanor stood by Daniel's side, watching him laugh, breathe, exist without pain, she finally began to believe in something she had never dared to before. She began to believe in a future. For as long as she could remember, Eleanor had been a woman running from shadows. She had learned to keep her distance, to live without attachments, to accept that love was not meant for her. But now, as she stood in the warmth of the morning sun, Daniel's hand wrapped gently around hers, she realized something astonishing. She was no longer running. She no longer had to. The town that had once whispered about her in fear now looked at her with something different in their eyes. Respect, curiosity, even admiration. The woman they had once called cursed had defied the stories, had outlived the myths. She had not destroyed a man. She had saved one. She had saved herself. And in doing so, she had changed something far greater than her own fate. She had changed the belief of an entire town. There were still those who looked at her with suspicion, who refused to believe that the curse was truly gone. But Eleanor no longer cared for their opinions. She had wasted too many years letting the world define her. Now, she would define herself. And so, with a quiet, determined strength, she did something she had never done before. She let herself plan a life with Daniel, a life without fear, a life where she could love freely and without consequence. And as she took that first step toward an unknown future, she did not hesitate, because for the first time, she was walking toward something, rather than away from it. It did not happen overnight, but change rarely does. The town, once filled with whispers and superstition, began to shift in ways even Eleanor could not have predicted. The men, once too fearful to meet her gaze, now nodded in acknowledgment when they passed her on the street. The women, once eager to tell tales of her misfortune, now came to her not with judgment, but with curiosity. They asked about her past, about her story, not as gossip, but as truth seekers. And for the first time, Eleanor told them. She told them of Lilith, of the man who had cursed her, of the lie that had shaped generations of women. She told them of Daniel, of Henry, of how fear had kept them all prisoners for so long. And as the story spread, something remarkable happened. The town began to let go of its own ghosts. It was not just Eleanor's family that had suffered under the weight of belief. It was all of them. They had all, in one way or another, lived under control of stories that had been passed down, never questioned, never challenged. But now, with the truth laid bare, they began to rewrite their own endings. And perhaps that was a real curse all along. The way fear can shape a life. The way belief can kill just as surely as any blade. But if fear could destroy, then surely belief in something better could heal. Love, Eleanor realized, had never been the enemy. It was not love that had killed, that had stolen, that had destroyed. It was possession. It was control. It was a belief that love was something to be owned, something to be claimed rather than given freely. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all. Love that cages is not love. It is a curse of its own. But love that sets free, that is a kind of love that breaks curses. That is the kind of love that endures. Eleanor had spent her life fearing love, but now she understood. Love was not meant to be feared. It was meant to be chosen, again and again, without force, without expectation, without chains. And so, as she stood beside Daniel, watching the town that had once been her prison now become her home, she made a choice, not just to love him, not just to stay, but to live fully, fearlessly, and without regret. The past had shaped her, but it did not own her. The curse had haunted her, but it did not define her. And the man who had started it all, the spirit who had clung to her bloodline like an unshakable shadow, he was nothing more than a whisper in the wind. And Eleanor? She was finally, truly, undeniably free.